Northern France, July 1944. The morning sky is bruised with cloud streaks, sunlight glinting off contrails that crisscross like scars. 30,000 feet below, a formation of B-17s drifts through the haze, their silver bellies flashing over farmland that's already burning. Above them, 4 P-47 Thunderbolts cut lazy circles, the guardians, fuel running low, nerves running thinner. Lieutenant Jack Hawk Brenner scans the horizon through a cracked canopy, his right hand hovering over the throttle. Static crackles through the headset. Bandits, 11 o'clock high, 15 plus, moving fast. He squints. Tiny black dots appear in formation, shimmering against the glare. Focke-Wulf 190s, 15 of them. The first pass comes like a hammer. 2 B-17s vanish in orange blossoms of fire. A third tumbles, wings snapping. Brenner curses under his breath and kicks the rudder. His squadron breaks left, outnumbered 4 to 15. Then it happens. His wingman, Callahan, catches a burst from below. The P-47 flips, disintegrates mid-roll, and what's left of it tumbles past Brenner's canopy, trailing smoke and flame. Every instinct screams run. Instead, Brenner does the unthinkable. He slams the throttle closed, drops full flaps, and yanks the stick left, hard. The P-47 lurches into a brutal flat skid, a move pilots were taught never to attempt. At 340 mph, the G-force hammers his chest like a fist. His vision tunnels, blood drains from his head. The aircraft groans, the wings flex, rivets pop. For an instant, he thinks it's tearing apart. Then, it catches. The Thunderbolt snaps into a half-roll, flipping beneath the enemy's dive. The German formation overshoots, their tracers cutting empty sky. Brenner slams the throttle forward again, engines howling as the P-47 claws into a climbing spiral. He jerks the stick back, rolls inverted, and lines up behind the lead 190. One burst, a flash of flame. The first German falls. The radio explodes with voices. "Jesus Christ, Hawk, what did you just do?" He doesn't answer. His vision's blurry. Sweat drips into his eyes. His plane is shaking like a wet dog. But it's flying. 40 seconds. That's all it took. When the sky clears, 2 Germans are down, the rest scattering west. Brenner levels off, gasping for air. Somewhere below, the bombers keep flying. He looks down at his hands, trembling over the controls, and whispers, "Don't ever make me do that again." But deep down, he knows the impossible worked. Every pilot in the U.S. Army Air Forces had the same sentence burned into his brain: don't fight the plane. It was the first rule of flight training, the one no one questioned. Manuals drilled it, instructors barked it, and every classroom blackboard from Florida to Arizona carried the same chart. Maximum safe load, 6 Gs. Anything above that, and the wings could shear, the pilot could black out, or the fuselage could twist beyond recovery. That was the doctrine. Precision, control, smooth energy management. You turned wide, not sharp. You outclimbed your opponent, you didn't try to outbreak him. Because above 400 mph, even the toughest fighter in the world could become its own executioner. But Jack Brenner wasn't the kind of man who learned from chalkboards. He'd been called reckless since flight school. His instructors wrote that he flew like a man trying to break the air itself. One even told him, "You'll kill yourself before the enemy ever gets the chance." Brenner had smiled, kicked the throttle, and said, "Maybe, sir, but I'll die flying, not gliding." To the Air Corps, rules meant safety. To Brenner, rules meant predictability. And in a sky full of Germans, predictability meant death. The gentle turn was the gospel of aerodynamics. Keep energy high, stay stable, never bleed speed. But to Brenner, that logic only worked in textbooks, not when 15 fighters were gunning for your tail. He'd watched enough of his friends die mid-roll, obeying perfect procedure right into a perfect grave. So when the time came, when those FW-190s screamed down from the clouds like wolves on a kill, he didn't think about drag coefficients or structural stress. He thought about survival. He thought about motion the way a coyote thinks about a fence, something to go through, not around. Every test pilot knew the P-47's roll rate was limited by its weight. Its inertia made it sluggish, safe, and stable. But Brenner had realized something simple. If he could use that weight instead of fighting it, he could make the plane fall into its own turn, dragging the enemy past the point of no return. It was suicidal, unscientific, and absolutely insane. But that's the difference between pilots who survive and pilots who follow rules. Brenner's madness was about to become mathematics. Written in exhaust trails and gunfire, Jack Brenner was born in the wide, wind-cut plains of southern Idaho, where the sky seemed endless and the land unforgiving. His family ran cattle, and like every ranch kid, he learned early that hesitation could kill. He grew up chasing strays through dust storms, mending fences and fixing tractors with whatever scrap he could find. By 14, he was driving pickup trucks over open range, skidding them sideways through sand gullies just to feel the tires bite. Flying came naturally. In 1938, a barnstormer passed through Boise, offering short joy rides for $2 a seat. Brenner borrowed the money from his father and never came down the same man. The next week, he found work sweeping hangars at a crop dusting service just so he could trade labor for lessons. His first flight instructor, a former airmail pilot, said Brenner didn't fly like a student. He flies like he's arguing with gravity. When the war began, he enlisted immediately. During pilot training in Texas, his instructors labeled him uncontrollable. He ignored formation discipline, broke altitude rules, and once buzzed the control tower at 20 feet. But every time he pushed the limit, he learned something the manuals didn't teach: how a plane feels on the edge of stall, how the air hums just before the controls stiffen, how to ride a slipstream instead of fight it. His classmates called him Hawk because he never stopped scanning the sky, even during downtime. He'd sit outside the barracks, watching clouds roll over the plains, studying how they moved, how wind sculpted them into arcs and spirals. He wasn't chasing beauty. He was studying survival. By 1943, Brenner had earned a spot in the 56th Fighter Group under Colonel Hub Zemke, the Wolf Pack, the deadliest unit of P-47s in Europe. Zemke valued aggression but demanded discipline, and he saw something in Brenner that most officers didn't: raw instinct. "Some men think too much up there," Zemke said once. "Hawk doesn't think, he reacts." That instinct often got him in trouble. He'd break off formation to chase stragglers, pull high G turns that made his wingman lose sight of him, and roll through his own contrails just to test how turbulence would throw the Thunderbolt off balance. More than once he came back to base with stress cracks on the wings, but always with kills. To the Army, Brenner was reckless. To the sky, he was fluent. He didn't fly by rules or charts. He flew by feel, by motion, by pulse. And when the day came that 15 German fighters dropped from the clouds above France, every crazy maneuver, every reckless roll, every rule he'd ever broken would come together, not as chaos, but as instinct sharpened into art. The air war over Europe was math in motion. Altitude, velocity, roll rate, climb angle. Every fight between life and death was a geometry problem written at 400 miles an hour. On paper, the Luftwaffe owned that math. The Focke-Wulf 190A, Germany's premier dogfighter, could roll at 160 degrees per second, outturn the American P-47 by nearly 30%, and climb faster at all altitudes below 15,000 feet. Its twin 20mm cannons hit with surgical precision. Against that, the U.S. Thunderbolt looked like a flying anvil. The P-47 weighed 8 tons fully loaded, almost twice its German rival. Its wide fuselage made it stable but sluggish. Its controls stiffened above 350 for making tight turns nearly impossible. Pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, a name that was both respect and insult. It could take punishment, but it wasn't built for finesse. Combat manuals said the only way to survive a Wonder 90 attack was to climb or dive, never turn. Turning was suicide. But war isn't fought on paper. Brenner's instinct told him that the P-47's weight wasn't weakness. It was momentum. The plane's inertia, if handled right, could swing it through a turn faster than the enemy expected. It was like throwing a hammer. Once in motion, its own mass became the weapon. Every second in a dogfight carried its own math. A 190 could adjust roll and pitch faster, but it bled energy quicker too. The heavier P-47 lost speed slower, its massive frame storing kinetic energy like a spring. Brenner realized that by cutting throttle mid-turn and using his plane's drag as a counterforce, he could pivot around his own center of gravity, essentially using the plane's weight to trip the air around him. That was the physics behind the insane turn. Not agility, not power, but drag used as leverage. Flight engineers would later calculate what Brenner did instinctively. His throttle drop and full flap skid turn created a brief induced vortex across both wings, balancing lift just long enough to flip the plane's direction in under 3 seconds. It was an accident of torque, friction, and faith. And faith was the only thing that mattered when the numbers said you were already dead. Brenner wasn't supposed to win that fight. But when the math failed, when lift curves and torque limits collapsed, it was his human chaos, his cowboy instinct that rewrote the equations. Because sometimes, in the arithmetic of war, the only number that matters is one man who refuses to add up. The mission was supposed to be routine, a high-altitude escort for the 305th Bomb Group, en route to strike rail yards near Caen. The morning was clear, visibility perfect. At 27,000 feet, the sunlight shimmered off 100 contrails that trailed east like threads of glass. Brenner's 4-ship Element flew high cover over the formation, the P-47s glinting silver against the blue. Then the warning came. 15 bogies, 11 o'clock high. They appeared like shadows materializing out of heaven. 15 FD-190s, diving in tight formation, sunlight flashing off their wings. Their leader, a veteran of the Eastern Front, had picked the perfect angle. The American bombers were spread too wide and the escorts too few. The first pass was slaughter. A B-17 exploded mid-air, its tail spinning away in silence. Another took a burst to the wing and rolled into the clouds. Brenner's wingman Callahan yelled, "Break left! Break left!" The 4 Thunderbolts banked hard, but the Germans were already in the dive. Tracers hissed past Brenner's canopy so close he could feel the static crackle in his headset. Then Callahan's voice cut short with a scream. A burst hit his engine, and the P-47 disintegrated in flame. Brenner's world narrowed to chaos and motion. He threw the stick left, but too late. A 190 shot passed, guns flashing. His warning light flared red, hydraulic pressure dropping. He had 10 seconds, maybe less. That's when instinct took over. Instead of running, Brenner slammed the throttle shut, dropped full flaps, and kicked hard left rudder. The plane lurched, skidding sideways through its own slipstream. The G-force crushed his chest, over 8 Gs, maybe 9. His vision blurred, the edges of his sight turning black. The P-47 groaned in protest, wings flexing, rivets popping like gunfire. The aircraft wasn't turning anymore. It was falling sideways, twisting around its center of gravity like a coin flipping in slow motion. The Germans overshot, their formation breaking apart. Then, in a move no manual could describe, Brenner shoved the stick forward, full opposite rudder. The torque rolled him under the enemy formation, inverted, falling through the sky at 400 mph. For 3 seconds, the world was upside down. Then, gravity and thrust met halfway. The P-47 snapped upright, nose pointed straight at the nearest 190. Brenner fired a 1-second burst. Tracers stitched across the German's fuselage. Fire erupted. "Where the hell is he?" someone shouted over the radio. "Right behind you," Brenner said. The fight turned. The Luftwaffe formation scattered, their perfect geometry shattered by one man's chaos. Brenner rolled through the smoke, chasing another target. The P-47 shook violently, the airframe on the edge of tearing apart, but the wings held. He fired again. Another burst, another kill. 40 seconds. That's all it took. When the last German dove for the deck, Brenner leveled out, breathing hard, his body drenched in sweat. The instrument panel was rattling, hydraulic pressure flickering near zero, but the plane still obeyed. "Jesus, Hawk," his flight leader said, voice shaking. "What in God's name did you just do?" Brenner stared at the sky where the enemy had been and muttered, "I just stopped thinking." The impossible turn, born from instinct, executed by madness, had just rewritten the book on survival. When Brenner landed back at Halesworth, his knees were shaking so badly he could barely climb down from the cockpit. The ground crew swarmed the P-47 and froze. The wings were warped, rivet lines stretched like seams ready to burst. The stress gauges on both spars showed readings past tolerance. The Thunderbolt had survived forces no aircraft of its kind was ever meant to endure. The engineers took one look and muttered, "This shouldn't have worked." It didn't make sense. The P-47's airframe had been pushed beyond 8 Gs. At that load, even steel fatigues. But when they ran the data later, the numbers told a strange truth. Brenner's insane turn hadn't just survived the physics. It had used them. By dumping throttle and deploying full flaps at high speed, he'd created a controlled aerodynamic stall. Normally, that would cause a wing drop and spin-out. But Brenner's timing was perfect. The slipstream wrapped around the fuselage evenly, generating what engineers later called a dual vortex bubble. It bled speed symmetrically across both wings. The drag was violent, but balanced. For roughly 3 seconds, his P-47 wasn't flying. It was tumbling in perfect equilibrium. That was why the airframe didn't tear apart. His instinct had transformed uncontrolled fall into temporary balance. A test pilot at Wright Field later described it in a report. Lieutenant Brenner's maneuver redistributed load by total energy bleed. An impossible feat of reflex. He weaponized chaos. The human body shouldn't have survived either. 8 Gs compresses organs, darkens vision, floods the brain with black spots. Pilots lose consciousness in seconds. But Brenner had grown up hauling cattle ropes, gripping machines that fought back. He could take pain the way most men take a breath. In simulator tests, his maneuver produced an overload equivalent to 200 pounds of force pressing on his chest. Somehow, he had stayed conscious, even aimed and fired under that pressure. He didn't calculate any of it. He didn't know the terms for drag coefficient or roll inertia. But he had felt what engineers could only describe in graphs. In the war's cold equations, instinct shouldn't win. Aerodynamics should. But on that day over France, one man's gut rewrote the flight tables. And the laws of motion, for 40 impossible seconds, bent just enough for him to live. 2 hours after the dogfight, Brenner sat in the debriefing hut, still drenched in sweat and reeking of oil. The officers around the table had no idea what to make of him. His flight log was smeared with pencil marks, his hands still shaking from the G-force. One major leaned forward and asked, "Lieutenant, are you aware of what you just did up there?" Brenner looked blank. "Yeah. I stayed alive." What he didn't say, what no one yet realized, was that his maneuver had just saved 18 bombers and their crews. The strike on Caen's rail junction had gone bad from the start. The Luftwaffe had scrambled nearly 30 fighters in 2 coordinated waves. The B-17s were spread too thin, the escorts too low on fuel. In every briefing room from England to France, overwhelming numerical superiority was a phrase pilots feared. Once the German formation got inside a bomber stream, losses multiplied fast. But when Brenner's P-47 broke formation and executed that suicidal flat turn, it didn't just save him, it shattered the Luftwaffe's geometry. From the ground, British radar operators tracked the moment the enemy formation fractured. The lead flight of FW-190s, thrown off by Brenner's maneuver, lost synchronization and peeled apart. The second wave, diving in behind them, collided mid-turn. In 30 seconds, the perfect German pincer attack dissolved into chaos. That chaos was all the bombers needed. Lieutenant Hanley, flying tail-end Charlie in one of the B-17s, later recalled, "1 second we were dead. Next second the sky just opened up. Those fighters scattered like birds hit by thunder." Every aircraft in that formation made it home. Not one was lost after Brenner's break. In the combat report filed later that night, his flight leader wrote, "Lieutenant Brenner executed an unapproved high-G maneuver under extreme pressure. Result: 2 enemy aircraft destroyed, remainder disengaged. Entire bomber group completed mission." When word reached Colonel Hub Zemke, he sent a short message back to the operations tent. "Find out what the hell he did, and if it can be taught." The mechanics weren't so impressed. They spent the next 48 hours pulling panels off Brenner's P-47 and shaking their heads. The right wing's skin was warped. Several ribs had microfractures, and the tail section had nearly twisted off its bolts. The plane had been seconds from disintegration. But that didn't matter. The math was clear. The impossible turn had bought the Wolfpack time to regroup, reform, and escort the bombers home. To the brass, it was reckless bravery. To the men who flew beside him, it was divine madness. To Brenner, it was just instinct. When asked about it in the bar that night, he said only one thing: "I didn't outfly them. I just made them think the sky broke." And for 15 Luftwaffe pilots that morning, that illusion had been enough to end the hunt. The next morning, Brenner's P-47 sat in the corner of the dispersal yard, silent and battered. The aircraft looked more like a survivor than a fighter. Paint scorched, wing panels buckled, and rivet lines slightly warped. Mechanics circled it like surgeons examining a patient that shouldn't be breathing. 8.3 Gs, muttered Sergeant Donnelly, the crew chief, tapping a cracked stress gauge. "If she'd gone a fraction higher, her wings would have folded clean off." Brenner stood nearby, sipping black coffee and pretending not to hear. His shoulders were sore, his spine felt compressed, and his helmet strap had left a deep red welt under his chin. He looked like a man who'd wrestled gravity, and won. By noon, word of his maneuver had reached the group command hut. Colonel Zemke summoned him immediately. Brenner walked in, hat in hand, boots still dusty from the tarmac. Zemke didn't say a word for the first 30 seconds, just stared at him, expression unreadable. "Lieutenant," he finally said, "you're aware that you broke about 6 separate Air Force regulations yesterday?" "Yes, sir." "You realize your aircraft is 1 hair away from being a structural write-off?" "Yes, sir." "And you also realize," Zemke continued, leaning forward, "that because of what you did, 18 bombers made it home that wouldn't have otherwise?" Brenner hesitated. "Sir, I just reacted. Didn't think." Zemke cracked a faint smile. "That's exactly why you're still alive." The colonel grounded him for 72 hours, not as punishment, but to let the engineers tear down the plane and figure out how it hadn't killed him. They found fatigue fractures in both wings, minor distortion in the tail, and even 1 fuel line kinked from the G-force compression. But somehow the P-47 remained airworthy. The engineering division wrote a 10-page report titled "Unscheduled High-G Control Experiment. Case Study, Pilot Brenner, J." Its conclusion was as baffled as it was grudgingly respectful. Unintentional exploitation of torque-induced lift redistribution. Results: effective, repeatable under extreme risk. Recommendation: not to be attempted intentionally. That evening, Brenner sat alone in the maintenance hangar, staring at the twisted skin of his aircraft. Donnelly walked up, wiping his hands on a rag. "She held together 'cause you listened to her," the mechanic said. "You felt where she wanted to go." Brenner just nodded. "She told me when to let go." A week later, The insane turn was quietly added to an unofficial training manual circulating among fighter groups. Emergency evasive maneuver. Brenner roll. Unverified. No commendation followed, no medal, no fame. But within months, other pilots began to whisper his name. Because in the sky, men remembered the impossible, especially when the impossible worked. And every time a P-47 pilot threw his plane into a desperate roll, there was always someone on the radio saying, "Try it like Hawk did." When the engineers at Wright Field finished dissecting the Brenner incident, they didn't file it under reckless behavior. They filed it under anomalous aerodynamic event. It was the Air Force's bureaucratic way of saying, "We don't know how, but it worked." Their report was clinical, pages of torque graphs, wing stress data, and mathematical curves that tried to explain something human. Yet buried in the final paragraph was a sentence that stood out. Lieutenant Brenner demonstrated controlled loss of stability, resulting in a reversal of pursuit geometry, heretofore considered impossible in propeller-driven aircraft. That line was history. In pilot schools across England, instructors began quietly showing the maneuver on chalkboards. "Never try this intentionally," they'd say, and then add, "unless you have no other choice." What had started as one man's act of desperation became doctrine in disguise. When jet fighters entered service the next year, engineers noticed the same physics applied. Sudden throttle cuts at high angles of attack could reverse inertia and trick pursuers. The Air Force later codified it as energy bleed turns. Brenner's madness had become a template. He didn't know any of this, of course. He wasn't reading memos or studies. He was still flying, still escorting bombers across northern France, his plane patched and scarred but unbroken. Other pilots began trying smaller versions of his maneuver, learning where instinct ended and death began. The 56th Fighter Group logged a 30% increase in survival rates for outnumbered flights in the months following his insane turn. But Brenner never bragged. He never claimed to invent anything. When a young pilot once asked him, "How'd you know it would work?" Brenner smiled and said, "Didn't, but I knew what not doing anything would get me." That was the lesson the Air Corps would never forget, that in a war obsessed with precision, the greatest weapon was still the human sense of motion, fear, and timing. Rules built the planes. Instinct kept them alive. And for 40 impossible seconds in 1944, the laws of flight bent for one man who refused to obey them. After the war, Jack Hawk Brenner went home to Idaho. The war's thunder faded into the hush of wind through wheat fields, and the roar of engines was replaced by the quiet hum of his crop duster. He didn't talk about dogfights or kill counts. When neighbors asked how he'd survived so many missions, he'd grin and say, "Guess I just turned the wrong way at the right time." He rebuilt his father's ranch, fixed tractors, and taught his nephews to shoot by watching wind, not targets. To him, war wasn't glory. It was proof that instincts matter when logic ends. On the barn wall hung a black and white photo of his battered P-47. Below it, hand-painted in red letters, were 3 words: "Trust the turn." In 1962, a young pilot training for Vietnam visited him, tracking down the legend of the insane turn. Brenner showed him how to feel the wind through his fingertips, how to read clouds, how to listen for the heartbeat of a machine. "A plane'll tell you what it wants," he said. "You just gotta quit arguing long enough to hear it." He died a quiet man in 1974. No medals on his shelf, no headlines on his wall. But for every pilot who ever broke formation and lived, there was a piece of him in the air, the ghost of a cowboy who once bent gravity, if only for 40 seconds. Because sometimes survival isn't science. It's faith in the turn.